that we are launching a new webinar series, which is with prominent lawyers, thought leaders, and practitioners around the globe. And hopefully this will be interesting to numerous people within the UBA community. And I'm very happy to introduce today our first inaugural speaker, Mark Ellis. And Mark is a good friend of the Ukrainian Bar Association. Mark is an executive director of the International Bar Association, and he is a good friend of Ukraine. Mark has been supporting Ukraine for a number of years, traveling to Ukraine many times, probably many more times than quite a few other international lawyers and politicians. And he has good connections with Ukrainian government, and is actually supporting the Ukrainian government on various issues of international public law. And we will be talking more about that today. Apart from that, Mark is a very famous international criminal law attorney, and he has been recently admitted as a fellow to King's College in London. And in the past, he has acted as a legal advisor to the Independent International Commission on Kosovo, and that was chaired by Justice Goldstone, and worked on other international tribunals, including the Serbia War Crimes Tribunal. Mark is teaching at various universities, including in the United States. And I think this talk today would be interesting for those who are interested in the international public law in general, international criminal law. And we will try to keep it short. We'll try to make it in 45 minutes. If you have any questions, please use the chat. I know that you are here live, so please mute yourself. But we'll be having our Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so you will have the chance to ask your question directly to Mark as well. So without further ado, Mark, thank you again for joining and finding time. Joining this webinar, finding time to talk to our audience today. I would like to start by, first of all, thanking for all of your dedication to Ukraine and efforts to support Ukraine. And the topic of our discussion is, of course, the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So maybe just to break the ice, tell us a few words about your view on the Russian aggression and the violation of international law principles in its war against Ukraine.
Well, Mykola, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be asked to be part of this event, this inaugural event. As you alluded to, Ukraine is deeply embedded in me personally, as to the efforts that I've tried to undertake over the last number of years. And I continue to stand firmly with Ukraine, and even under the challenges that we're facing, I'll continue to push the international legal community to support. So yes, I mean that is the critical issue, isn't it? And it reminds me of the fact that next year will be the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter. Quite extraordinary, and that charter for me was a milestone, probably the most significant milestone in modern history, and it was because it established a legal framework. The charter established a kind of a framework for not only a new legal world order, but really a constitution that would embrace the international community. And it was based on this idea to ensure that future generations would live in peace. And when you look at the preamble of the charter, it really talks about that. It talks about saving future generations from the scourge of war. That's a pretty powerful aspiration on this. And this is why, for me, Russia's war against Ukraine is such a a stark indictment against these kind of fundamental principles. And when you look at the UN Charter, for me, the most fundamental principle of international law is embedded in the Charter. And it's embedded in a way that says there is a prohibition against the use of force against the territorial integrity of another state. And that is exactly what Russia has violated. And so for me, it's even more important because Russia's success, if they succeed in their objectives in Ukraine, it will be a real devastating blow for international law and for the UN Charter. And I think most importantly for me, Russia's success will create a very new geopolitical landscape. It will, I think, increase and embed, autocratic states in the region and elsewhere. It will bring a new ideology that's based on this issue of authoritarianism. And that, what does that mean? It means that the paradigm will shift, and that the idea of upholding international law will disappear. And instead, we'll see more of what we're seeing now, of the ability to dismiss multilateralism and be very comfortable in violating the territory of states. And so military conflicts, I think, will increase. I think we're in a bit of a new Cold War. I think that Cold War becomes colder. But most importantly, this idea of what the UN Charter 80 years ago set out in the sense of international law, in the sense of upholding the rights of states not to be invaded, in order to, and the international law that says the crime of aggression is really the most serious, because it starts all other, it's the catalyst to all other crimes. And so I feel, Mykola, very, very passionate about this issue. And it's why I believe that it's critical that the international community stays very firm in its support for Ukraine to ensure that Russia does not achieve its objectives. Because if they do, if the country does do that, if Mr. Putin is successful in this, I think it changes the entire legal parameters that were created after World War II with the Charter. And I think that will be devastating. And so the stakes, I don't think, could be higher than what we're witnessing now in Ukraine.
Thank you, Mark. Speaking of the international legal community, what's your take on the establishment of the special tribunal on the crime of aggression? Do you think it's realistic to have it, and in what form?
Well, it's interesting. When I first arrived in Ukraine after the second iteration of Russia's war against Ukraine nearly 3 years ago, this idea of creating some type of mechanism directed at Russia or its leadership for the crime of aggression was set out, and was set out by Ukrainians. It was set out in I recall having meetings with the Ukrainian government, and they were talking about that. And I have to say, even back then, I was thinking, well, this may be a bit premature, because war has just started. War crimes are being committed. Other atrocity crimes are being committed, violating international humanitarian law. And of course, I thought, well, it's possible that the International Criminal Court could have this jurisdiction. As time went on, I think everyone realized that, well, the ICC does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in relations to this conflict. And so you immediately dismiss the ability for the ICC to play a role in ensuring that the leadership of Russia are brought to justice for the crime of aggression. So then you had to look elsewhere. And I won't go through the history of this over the past 3 years, but there's been many iterations of potential ways of establishing a process for bringing to justice for the crime of aggression the leadership of Russia. I think it has come down to the best option right now is the option of running this through the Council of Europe, and I think that that's where you have the best opportunity. We know that we have the Council of Europe has approved this, has outlined a procedure for to create a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, and I think this is the best way of doing this. Creating some type of hybrid tribunal is not going to work. Doing a tribunal specifically or exclusively in Ukraine will not work. Always legal hurdles. But I think if the Council of Europe is able to create this special tribunal and at the same time invite other states outside of Europe to join and to support this special tribunal, then it really becomes an international tribunal. And of course, that's critical in order to ensure that you can avoid this legal prohibition about head of state immunity. And if you can create an international tribunal, then international law allows that type of international tribunal to ignore or not recognize head of state immunity, which, as we all know, is recognized generally under international law. So that's why I'm confident, and I believe the Council of Europe approach now is the best approach to ensure that we could have a tribunal for the crime of aggression focused on the leadership of Russia. And I believe that should happen. It must happen, because if we don't act as an international community to the aggression from Russia against Ukraine under the circumstances that we've witnessed over the last 3 years, then I'm not sure when we would ever do it, because this is so apparent and the evidence is so overwhelming that I think it requires the international community to act in a robust way. And so this is why I support the Council of Europe approach.
And does the Council of Europe itself support this idea? Is it open to it? And what about states that are not part of Europe? Are they also supporting the idea of such a tribunal under the Council of Europe?
Well, so far we have seen the Council of Europe with great support for the idea. So yes, I think now there are still the details have certainly not been worked out, but the consensus is there through the Council to move forward with the special tribunal. But again, as we know, there are many additional steps that need to be made, need to be taken. But the possibility of creating this under within the Council of Europe structure, and then allow other states outside the Council of Europe to join and to be part of this special tribunal, is what I think is the best option. And that would ensure that this special tribunal becomes internationalized in a significant way. And I think that's what's going to be needed to ensure that it gets over these legal hurdles in relations to head of state immunity. So I think this is the best path to take. We're not there yet, but there's been important steps taken, and I'm fully supportive of it.
Can you explain what do you mean by internationalized tribunal? And in addition to that, will that tribunal be, to put it simply, similar to a Nuremberg tribunal eventually?
Well, I think you could look at it. Well, first of all, the when I talk about kind of the internationalized being an international tribunal, I say this because international law, particularly a particular case that you've probably all of you have probably heard about, the arrest warrant case from the International Court of Justice, in essence says that this the head of state immunity that's embedded in international law is something that must be accepted and must be followed, must be adhered to. But the exception to that rule or that norm is if there is an international court that's been created, then that international court doesn't have to recognize head of state immunity. And so, for instance, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in its statute, does not recognize head of state immunity. Therefore, a sitting head of state can be indicted, which is exactly what we saw with the ICC's arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, being a sitting head of state, was not protected by head of state immunity because the arrest warrant came from an international tribunal. So this is the hurdle one has to get over. It's never been done before. We haven't seen this before. And Nuremberg is, to me, quite different because the circumstances were quite different in the sense of end of a war. So I think you have to look at more modern examples of trying to create this type of a court, a special tribunal. And the Council of Europe, which comprises, 46 member states, oftentimes it's seen as when the ICC treaty was ratified, that treaty, the ICC treaty reached, I think, 60 ratifications when it was first launched. And so that tends to be, people tend to think that might be the magic number. But my view is the Council of Resolution out of the Council of Europe with 46 member states, that's exceedingly strong. Opening it up to other states to join with the Council of Europe on this special tribunal will certainly bring it over the 60 ratifications that you saw with the ICC, for instance. So that's what I'm talking about, is getting a court that's internationalized, that would be seen as an international court. Because most of the courts, for instance, the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, for instance, those were UN Security Council created courts. And therefore, that's clearly would be seen as sufficient to be recognized as international. But here we have to do it differently. But I'm fairly confident that international law will see the process that's being debated now through the Council of Europe as being sufficient to meet the requirements of an international court, which in turn would allow that court to ignore head of state immunity.
Well, it only remains for us to hope that this court will be established sooner rather than later, hopefully in the course of the next year. We definitely support this as the Ukrainian Bar Association, and have recently issued a statement on this. Now, if I may switch gears and turn to a slightly different adjacent topic of war crimes. As you and I know, the Ukrainian Bar Association, with the help of the International Bar Association, has been actively involved in the monitoring of war crime trials in Ukraine and various cities, and has issued several reports. This was funded by USAID, and the Ukrainian Bar Association now is moving into the next phase. But we started off with the help of the IBA, with the guidelines for the monitoring of these war crime trials. And one of the themes that came up is, of course, the role of the defense counsel in these trials. And of course, the society in Ukraine is very much in pain. That's obvious. There's a lot of pressure and a lot of discussion. So I would like to hear your view on the role of the defense counsel in these particular types of crimes.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right. Since this is an audience for the UBA, I have to give great. I'm an admirer of what UBA has done on this issue, because it's not easy to focus on the rights of the accused, and the accused are those that are committing atrocities on Ukrainians' territory. That's exceedingly difficult and, as you said, painful. But I think it shows it shows what Ukraine as a nation is about, and it shows what Ukrainians are about, and that is upholding principles of justice and the rule of law. And international law requires that any individual that is being brought in front of a court receives defense representation, and of course receives an impartial, fair trial. And that requires a robust defense for that individual. And I've always said for Ukraine, that's exceedingly important, because the domestic trials that are taking place in Ukraine will be part of Ukraine's legacy once this war ends. It shows Ukraine's it shows Ukraine's ability to and willingness to abide by these international standards. Russia does not. Russia has not shown any willingness to adhere to international standards, and certainly has not done so under the most difficult circumstances, similar to what Ukraine is witnessing. So I think it's very, very important, even though I know how difficult it is for people to understand. Why would we at all be concerned with the rights of Russian soldiers who have alleged to have committed these crimes? Why are we concerned that they have a fair trial? And I always say, because it's about Ukraine. It's about Ukraine and its people, Ukrainians themselves, who understand the need to adhere to these international principles. And that's going to be, as I say, a legacy for Ukraine. That's why I support what the UBA is doing, and I believe this is a good thing that the IBA is supporting as well. And by the way, Mykola, I've been in situations in the past. I think about the Iraq tribunal, Saddam Hussein, those cases, and there were very serious problems with the fairness of those types of trials. And of course, what happens now is that when people talk about the process, the domestic process of trials in Iraq, they talk more about the deficiencies in the trials rather than the alleged crimes that were committed. And this is my point, that you need the emphasis to be on the fairness, and that will provide the legacy of Ukraine. When I first met Justice Richard Goldstone, the first prosecutor for the International Court for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, I was there involving in getting engaged with the first case of Tadic. And I remember Richard Goldstone, and mind you, he's the prosecutor of this new court, said publicly that the yardstick measurement of Mr. Tadić's case will not be whether he's found guilty, but whether he's had a fair trial. Justice Goldstone understood the importance of adhering to international principles of having an impartial, fair trial, and he was the prosecutor of this major first post-World War II tribunal, and I think that says a lot.
Well, I think the majority of our audience definitely shares that view in principle. And nonetheless, if you look at the practice, people who are judges, who are prosecutors, and who are defense counsel as well, come to these trials often after the air raids in the morning, or having spent the night with their kids in the bomb shelter. And I just wonder, I honestly don't like thinking that Ukraine is unique. I think history repeats itself in many forms, and Ukraine is not unique in the majority of cases. However, am I right that this is probably in the modern history a unique case where a country is adjudicating cases of war crimes during the war? Or maybe Ukraine, or maybe someone else has had that experience before.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Listen, undertaking domestic war crime trials, and I've been involved with a number of situations, that's exceedingly difficult. These are relatively new concepts. They're new areas of law. They're international law. Countries generally don't deal with these types of atrocity crimes unless, of course, they find themselves in war. And then generally they deal with them after the conflict. But to do so as the conflict is raging on, as it is here in Ukraine, that becomes nearly impossible. But here I do think Ukraine is unique. Because Ukraine is not only focusing efforts on undertaking trials during a war, an ongoing war, and as you say, pushing people in air raid shelters and causing complete havoc in their lives, but they're still undertaking these domestic trial processes. Not only that, but they're focused on doing it in a way that meets international standards of impartiality and fairness. Ukraine is laser focused on ensuring that these trials meet these types of standards. That to me is unique, and so as an outsider, I find that to be an incredible task and aspiration for Ukraine, undertaking these types of trials and focusing on ensuring that they're fair, and that includes ensuring that these suspects have defense lawyers counsel.
Would it be fair to say, Mark, that defense counsel specifically in such cases, are quite often under pressure by the society, by the system?
Yeah, there's absolutely no question about that. I mean, I think generally at any level, whether it's at the international standards, regional, certainly domestic, defense attorneys who step up and undertake this type of representation, they face an incredible onslaught of criticism. I think that's generally what happens. But this, for all of us as lawyers, this is part of our responsibility. You have joined a profession that incorporates the fundamental elements of a free society, a society that's based on the rule of law, principles of justice. this is what you do as lawyers. And the lawyers are the ones that are the last defense to upholding these principles. And one of these principles is ensuring that trials, even as complex as they are now in Ukraine for war crimes trials, meet international standards of fairness, and that requires defense. And so I applaud every lawyer who steps up and supports the concept of an impartial, fair trial, which requires attorneys to play this role as a defense attorney. And in doing so, they absolutely guarantee that at the end of those trials, everyone will look and say, we did this right. And we met standards that are important, not only internationally, but are important to us as part of the legal profession. That's what I think it's being done.
Thank you, Mark. I would like to say on the part of the UBA, based on our report, and they're available online, what is good is that both the judiciary and the prosecution are actively participating in the monitoring, in listening to the results of the monitoring. They are trying to improve their practice, both in terms of quality of judgments, the processes, the timing, and the access of the defense counsel to all the materials. There is always room for improvement based on our reports. There is always discussion about the level of involvement of the defense counsel. And we also need to realize that the predominant majority of cases that are being heard right now in Ukraine are in absentia, which is the necessity. And yet, so that creates a different level of complexity for the defense counsel and for making sure that the trials are fair in the long run.
But what, Mykola, you've just mentioned something so important. I don't remember a time when a country that is a victim of this aggression from another country and witnessing just an incredible number of atrocity crimes being committed against its own citizens, is also focused on ensuring that these trials are fair and impartial, including the idea of having a program that observes these trials and that it objectively reviews how the trials are being are occurring and how they're being undertaken. And this is what the UBA is doing. And that's an incredible, I think that to me says so much about the legal profession and about the UBA itself in Ukraine, that they're observing these trials and they are objectively trying to make those trials better. Again, that's why I come back and say, I think Ukraine is unique. And that's another example of why I think it is.
Well, that's really flattering. We, of course, all hope that the wars end soon, and we wish that we didn't have to go through this. And to the credit of the Ukrainian judiciary, we must admit that these judges, they've never had experience with these types of crimes before. Ukraine experienced that. It was there in the criminal code, in the procedural code, but it has never been tried. So, and yet these people are growing up and taking the challenge and making sure that the trials are fair.
And by the way, Mykola, all of you with the UBA and the lawyers, a generation from now, international community and other countries will actually look back to Ukraine, and they'll look to the legal profession, and they will be asking the legal profession in Ukraine to guide them on how you undertake these types of procedures and trials, because unfortunately, as the world goes, this is not the last of these types of conflicts. But Ukraine is positioning itself to be a leader now in in the international community on what good practice means in domestic war crimes trials. That's what's happening right now. I assure you that in the future, it's the experience in Ukraine that will be seen as an important barometer as to how things done.
Well, actually, this is a great segue to my last question to you about the transitional justice. To be honest, 9 months ago, 1 year ago, I never knew what that means. This is a new definition for me, and I'm pretty sure that it's a new definition, new term for many of our people in the audience, and definitely for the majority of people in Ukraine. Thinking about the future and the post-war, how do we deal with the collaboration cases and the borderline cases? Again, I know that Ukraine is not unique. Apparently there have been cases, and there were good and bad examples of transitional justice and various commissions that have been formed. Maybe you could tell us more about that and your views on that.
Yeah, I think transitional justice is is critical. People have oftentimes you will ask somebody, what does transitional justice mean? And you'll have some variations about what transitional justice means. But for me, no surprise, because I deal with a lot with the criminal cases, international criminal law. International justice is really creating kind of a comprehensive approach to focus on kind of what the aftermath of the conflict is, and particularly what human rights violations occurred, what atrocity crimes occurred. And at the heart of that, I think, is the ongoing effort to ensure that there's accountability for certain and some type of recognition of truth and reconciliation. I think those are the main things for me. And so for Ukraine, remember that in other conflict countries, Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, where I spent a lot of time, they're still doing cases today. So what Ukraine is doing right now, in sense of domestic prosecutions, will continue. And it will continue for a very long time. That's why it's so important that Ukraine is building up its capacity to do that. But so that's going to continue, and that's really gets to the accountability part of this equation on that. You've alluded to the fact that there has been other kind of truth-seeking initiatives, truth and reconciliation commissions, for instance, that have been there. I think that could very well be a big part of that. Documenting what happened, collecting testimonies of the survivors and witnesses, just creating a record. That is also part of ensuring that there is an understanding of what happened during the conflict, and it helps with this transitional part. And then finally, I think, is reparations and compensation. And I think that's a critical part of transitional justice for me. And this is where the international community is going to have to play a major role in ensuring that the aggressor, Russia, plays a major role in ensuring that there is reparations, particularly for Ukraine as a country, but also reparations and compensations to individuals. And we know that there's a process already going on that, in being able to file claims and setting out a process, and that will continue to happen on this. And I think that leads to, for transitional justice, an ongoing connection between Ukraine and the international community, building up its integration with the international community. The ratification of the Rome Statute is an important step in that way. Membership of the EU would be another for me. being part of NATO is another. It's engaging and interacting with the larger international community in new ways, and I think that's all part of this transitional justice process.
Yeah, well, we of course very much hope that Ukraine will become part of the European Union and sooner or later part of NATO. But in the meantime, what has been surprising to me, and why I think transitional justice and these truth and reconciliation commissions are important, is the following fact. Apparently, there are now more than 7,000 cases on collaboration, and some of them are definitely very terrible and need to be tried, but others are simple cases where someone was a teacher or someone remained in a very minor non-official or semi-official role, or someone who the craziest case for me was that a guy somewhere in the south of Ukraine, Kherson region probably, on Saturday in a bar spoke favorably about Russian soldiers, and was, of course, reported, taken by police, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Apart from the fact that probably that's an exaggeration, we need to think about the pressure on the judiciary that these cases create. And given that Ukraine is right now lacking about a third of required judges in the system, additional 7,000 cases on collaboration is a terrible impact on the system as a whole.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the not only the collaboration trials cases, but you look at the issue of just war crimes cases. And I don't know what the number is now. I think it's maybe over 130,000 that is now established by Ukraine. These are massive numbers, and so it would be unrealistic to think that each and every one of those cases will be seen through a trial process. So combining that with other mechanisms, I think, is a good thing on that. And again, I think the documentation part is really, really critical to bring some objective facts of what's happened. The IBA has our Eyewitness to Atrocities program that is being delivered in Ukraine by actually Ukrainian representatives that work with us, and that's all part of that documentation. Hopefully, will be helping with prosecuting Russian soldiers and others for international humanitarian violations, law violations. But it's also going to be important in just building a database of the atrocities and damage that has happened. So all of this is part of a rubric of different elements that make up transitional justice.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we are exactly at 45 minutes. We started a few minutes late, so I am happy to open the floor to a few questions. I see we have quite a number of people. Does anyone have a question?
Yeah, and don't be shy, please. And I may have said things you disagree with, so that's good too.
I saw a hand from Oksana Sivashenko.
Exactly. I wanted to ask, I don't quite understand how the execution of court decisions issued against the persons who committed war crimes will work. Ukraine should hold a fair trial, issue a decision, and then send the convicted person to serve their sentences at the expense of our taxpayers, how it was in, I don't know, Yugoslavia, because it's thousands of people who committed war crimes, and how it works, it cannot be a gain for the our cost.
And Mark, before you answer, there's a question in the chat which is complementary to what Oksana just said, and it says the following: do you think it is possible for Ukrainian judges to conduct an objective review of such categories of cases during war time? It's by Ella Kataeva.
Let me respond to that last one first, and I think the answer is yes, primarily because it was understood very early in Ukraine that Ukrainian judiciary needed to have additional support in education and understanding about these crimes. And that's happening right now. The judges have in fact, through USAID, also a judicial book. So I think there's a lot of support for judges, Ukrainian judges, to undertake these cases. And because there's not a specialized court in Ukraine, as there is in some other countries, to undertake these trials, it's spread throughout Ukraine. It's really important that all judges generally get this type of training. But it's challenging, but I think it's very I think so far Ukraine is doing it right from what I'm seeing on that. The question Oksana pointed out is a great one. It's a very relevant one. I think there's 2 points I would say. One, I have no doubt that if all of a sudden Ukraine was faced with many convicted individuals that went through the judicial process in Ukraine and that were sentenced to Ukrainian prisons, I actually don't think it's necessarily would be a burden on Ukrainian taxpayers, because I think the international community would absolutely step in and provide support to supplement that type of cost. I think that absolutely will happen. At the same time, I think you asked about in Yugoslavia and other places. Yes, they take on that responsibility to ensure that individuals who are found guilty will serve his or her sentence. But again, I think the international community will absolutely play a role on this. The second point is one of reality, and I think it's important to say this because Mykola mentioned this too. The vast majority, I think 90, maybe 95%, even more, of cases occurring in Ukraine right now are trials in absentia. The reality is these are trials against Russian soldiers who have alleged to have committed these crimes, war crimes primarily, and there's sufficient prima facie evidence to bring a case against them and put them in a trial in absentia. The question is, will that individual ever be apprehended in a way that is brought into to being serving his sentence in Ukraine? I think we have to be realistic about that and say that is a very challenging step. That takes a lot of political willingness, and so I think the reality is that you're not going to be, Ukraine's not going to be facing that major onslaught of convicted Russian soldiers who are now going to be serving time in Ukraine. But most importantly for me, and it's why I support trials in absentia if they're done correctly, gets back to this idea of a record. You document, and there's an understanding of the atrocities were being committed. And that's, to me, a very powerful part of this transitional justice part of it. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Mark. Dear colleagues, do you have any other questions?
Yes, if I may.
Yes, please.
So my name is Diana, and I would like to ask you, what kind of damages outside of criminal procedures we can use after the war, during this transitional justice period, you know? Like, because, yeah, as you said, that 95 and more, even more percent, that would be like that would be cases when victims they will be without fair justice. And they will be willing like moral damages, no, like moral, like even I can say like, money for their sufferers or something like this. So how we can create these damages outside the criminal procedures, or how we can like provide them this support. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm pleased to say that the international community is already moving in that direction. It is already its focus on reparations and compensation for suffering, for loss of life, for property damage. That is a major focus in the international community and the creation of this process. They're already moving in that direction. So the issue is what steps need to be taken in order to secure the assets, Russian assets, that is necessary to pay those reparations and compensations. But I'm absolutely convinced, based on the progress that's being made, that will happen, and that there will be a process and procedure to ensure that hopefully for most, if not all, that there will be some type of reparations compensation.
And of course, in the meantime, Ukraine has created in The Hague the register of damages that is at least the first step towards that potential compensation mechanism.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. It's interesting that things are moving, I think, fairly quickly on that side. And as I say, I think that type of ensuring that there is that record, as Mykola is saying, the creation of that process is important. And then it's only the matter of whether or not there is securing the assets, and that is also moving pretty quickly on that. So,
Mark, there is one more question in the chat, which basically says, "What's the change in leadership? Will the change in the political leadership in the world next year affect the process of bringing Russia to justice?" What's your view on that?
Alexandra has now asked the most critical question, I think, for me, and something that I'm dealing with regularly right now is because of the political leadership that's changing, particularly in the United States with Trump. What does that mean for the war? And there's no question that Biden's decision to allow the use of long-range missiles is part of trying to shore up Ukraine's position. So if there is negotiations or a forced negotiation from the Trump administration, that Ukraine will be in a better position. I think it's probably has come too late and not enough, but let's see what happens. It's better than having done nothing, which I've been critical of. So I come back to what I said at the start, that I think this is exceedingly important, not just for Ukraine, but for the concept of international law. If the international community is going to reward aggression that we have seen by Russia, then that will undermine the very principles of international law, and it may be irreversible damage to international law, particularly the underlying principles of the UN Charter. So I think there's no question that we're going to see a paradigm shift starting in January after President Trump, Donald Trump becomes president again. And I'm uncertain at the direction, but it's going to be very different than it was with Biden administration. The key will be whether Europe can stand firm and can keep a consolidated position. And we know that too is challenging, because even within Europe, you're beginning to see cracks. And so we're going to have to wait and see. But I'm hoping that whatever the settlement is, it's one that Ukraine wants, and it's one that ensures that the international legal principles that are so important for us, so important for the world, that they stay intact. We'll have to see.
On that note, I think we should remain optimistic. We in Ukraine have learned to be optimistic despite all the challenges. So I'd like to close this by saying thank you so much, Mark, for your efforts in supporting Ukraine, for your time now at this webinar. Thank you, colleagues, for joining and asking your questions. We really enjoyed this discussion. And I hope this is the beginning of a good new tradition of having such brilliant lawyers and thought leaders as Mark join us and share their views with us, with the Ukrainian legal community, which undoubtedly wants to be and is part of the international legal community. And we are proudly members of the International Bar Association. So thank you for that as well, Mark.
Mykola, thank you. And thank you all for I know how busy all of you are, and the fact that you came and listened to me and engaged with me is very special. So thank you. I stand firmly behind Ukraine, as Mykola says. I will be coming back yet again in January. I think that's my 7th visit, 8th visit, I don't know. But there's nothing more important to me than ensuring that Ukraine is successful in this battle against Russia, pure and simple. So thank you.